Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we are continuing our coverage of the 2016 Candidates Tournament. We are in round 2. For those just joining the coverage, very important tournament going on. The winner of this tournament plays Magnus Carlsen in November for the World Championship. So our opponents today, White's going to be played by the Russian Grandmaster Sergei Karjakin. His opponent playing the black pieces is Nakamura from the United States. Player that's probably playing better chess than anyone else in the world besides Magnus Carlsen. He's just been winning tournaments left and right. Definitely my pick to win the tournament. Also the player that I just am cheering for because I think he would do the United States proud. I think him and Magnus Carlsen facing off in a long championship in November would be really exciting for the chess community. Two very aggressive players, always going for the win in any position. So I think that'd be really cool. But we'll go ahead and get to it. Sergei Karjakin, definitely a strong player, and looking, especially with the white pieces, to come out on top in round 2. So we get started with pawn to d4, knight f6, pawn to c4, pawn e6, knight to f3, and then Nakamura kind of has an option. He can go with the Bogo Indian defense with bishop here to b4. Instead, he opts for the Queen's Indian defense with pawn to b6, getting ready to bring his bishop to either b7 or a6. White continues with pawn to g3, getting ready to bring his own bishop here to g2, fianchetto, try to counterattack, control these light squares in the center of the board. Nakamura plays bishop to a6. That's kind of the new normal. Back in the day, you would always see bishop here to b7, but bishop to a6 is a lot more common now, starting to attack this pawn here on c4. Now, there's a lot of ways that White can try to hold down this material here on c4. You always have knight to d2. Unfortunately, this kind of blocks this queen here on d1 from protecting this pawn here on d4. You have queen here to a4, which holds down the forward on c4, but also stops holding down this material on d4. And same kind of goes with queen here to c2 or b3 as well, which is why White usually continues with pawn to b3. What this does, though, is it kind of weakens the dark square. So bishop's going to always come down here to b4, which was what we see in the game from Nakamura. The knight can't come here to c3 is what a lot of times we'll see because the pawn on b2 is no longer protecting that. That's clearly going to be a mistake. But knight here to d2 also is just pretty uncomfortable for White. We see bishop here to c3, and then the the rook's gonna have to come here to b1, and then all of a sudden bishop here to b7, bishop down here to e4. Just puts a lot of pressure on White. All of a sudden, Black is all up in White's grill over here, and that's just not something that White wants to do. White wants to be pretty aggressive early on into the game. Having his opponent just run amok with the double bishop pair is not something that White wants to do. So in this particular spot, you're almost always going to be seeing bishop here to d2. And Black on this side, if he wants to go ahead and get the bishops off the board, he can. More common, though, is what Nakamura played, and that's bishop back here to e7. Now, bishop to g2, Sergei decides to go ahead and fianchetto his bishop on the king side. Now, pawn to d5, just trying to break up the center of the board a little bit. We do see the pawns come off the board. Castle on the king side, and then Nakamura also castles on the king side. Now, knight here to c3. So if we kind of look on board, we do have a semi-open square on the c file. So White is eventually going to bring one of his rooks over here to c1 to control the semi-open file. On the opposite side of the board, Nakamura has a semi-open file on the e file. So he eventually is going to bring his rook here to e8 as well. But knight to c3, just simple development move and adding more pressure on this square here on d5. Now knight here to d7. Nakamura wants to make sure that he can push forward with his pawn whenever he wants to. Pawn here to c5, and so knight here to c6, the more common development move, kind of stops that push. So decides to go ahead and play knight here to d7 first, and then queen here to c2, rook over here to e8 as we talked about. Rook here to d1. He had a few options. He could have played rook here to e1 if he wanted to, so he could push forward. That's fine. Could have even brought his rook over here to d1. Potentially wants to go ahead and play rook here to c1. So for now, decides to go ahead and play rook here to rook here to d1 from f1, and now knight back here to f8. Just right now, Nakamura doesn't have a lot of great options. It was just over time just trying to find a better position for his knight. So he kind of looks at it and says, okay, knight here on e6 is going to be a better position for me. Knight here to e5, bishop here to b7, trying to hold down this material right here on on d5, but you can tell the kind of the difference. White, his light square bishop here on g2 is attacking. Nakamura on the other side, his bishop here on b7 is more defending. Bishop back here to c2 or c1. Knight here to e6, attacking this pawn right here. Bishop here to b2, and then bishop down here to d6. Now, it was a little bit different right here. The knight can't just come and take right now. The rook's just going to take right back, but all of a sudden the bishop kind of changes things up. Now, if the knight were to take, doesn't matter if the rook takes, then the bishop could just take right here on e5. So white's kind of forced to play pawn to e3, which is not bad. Solidifies the pawn chain right now. Also protects this pawn here on d4. We now see Nakamura play pawn to a6, kind of looking at what Sergey can do. His dark square bishop is kind of locked in. This knight here at e5 doesn't really have any great squares to go to. It has a nice little outpost here. The light square bishop here on g2 absolutely is not going anywhere. He's just kind of holding down the fort right here. Both the rooks, they're not going to move too much, and the queen doesn't have too much going on. This knight right here on c3 is probably the only piece that can move somewhere, and so Nakamura is just trying to limit his opponent's moves. And this is something that you should always be looking for in your own game, is what's my opponent doing, what's he trying to do, and then how can I limit some of that success. So if we look at white, one of his options was knight here to b5, probably not going to be going anywhere else productive, and so pawn here to a6, although it seems like a pretty innocent move, it does a lot by protecting and solidifying this square here on b5. So Sergey kind of looked at this and said, okay, my knight's not going anywhere, so I do kind of need to move. I don't really have any other good options, so he decides to go ahead and play knight here to e2, getting ready to bring it over to the king side. He sees much more value with his knight over there. Now pawn here to c5, starting to break open this side of the board after we see an exchange on board, knight here to c5. I'm curious if Nakamura should have gone with something a little bit different. The reason I say this is this pawn here on d5 is now an isolated pawn, which just means there's no pawns on either side of it. And he's going to be forced to kind of defend this central square right here, where Sergey can just put all of his pieces and just start to really apply a lot of pressure to this pawn on d5. Just something I usually don't like to do in my own games is put a lot of just my defense out here. So he could have just, kept his c pawn, added a little bit of defense with his pawns. But right now it does have a central square here on d5 with no protection from pawn. So going to be a very, very important square for the rest of the match. Now, knight back here to d3, since that pawn here on d4 is no longer protecting the knight here. The knight is now kind of forced to move. Nakamura decides he does not want to exchange and instead decides to play knight here to e4, which is a nice little outpost. The pawn here on d5 does provide a lot of value because it's a central square. So knight here to e4 also kind of blocks off this bishop on g2 from kind of protecting it. What's interesting is we kind of go back a little bit. On this position, black has a fairly active position on the board, and when we come back just a few moves and we see, what could white have done in this position right here? He decided to go ahead and take and give Nakamura that isolated pawn, but he had a pretty interesting move, and I'm not sure if he even saw it because it is pretty crazy to come up with, but he had knight here to c4, which looks pretty interesting. But if you kind of dig a little deeper here, this pawn right here is actually protecting this bishop back here on b7. If the pawn takes here on c4, then all of a sudden the bishop takes here on b7. The rook can come here to b8. That's fine. Bishop on a6. The pawn could take. That's fine. Pawn takes here on b3. All of a sudden, this rook is kind of opened up to kind of do whatever he wants to. White's going to be up in material on board. If that pawn does not take that knight, this is also going to be completely fine. Really starts to put a lot of pressure both on this pawn here on b6, this bishop here on d6. So while white did not play this, not even sure if he saw this move, I do think that move would have been pretty interesting on board. But we come back to this position after the knight here on e4, and then rook over here to c1. Move that we talked about earlier, bringing the rook over here to c1, controlling this file, which has gone from a semi-open file to a fully open file. So Nakamura decides to bring his rook over here to c8. You never want your opponents to just dominate open files. It kind of just keeps you in a weird spot where they can get into your house very easily. Eventually, rook here to c7 could be very bad. So rook over here to c8, just trying to hold down the line right here. Queen's going to come back here to b1, make sure he's not in the line of fire. Queen here to e7. bishop here to d4, attacking this pawn here on b6. We do see an exchange on board, and then after the exchange, pawn here to b5. Wants to make sure that this bishop is not attacking. But bishop here on d4 is actually a pretty good square. It's an outpost here with the protection here on e3. It's controlling a lot of the center of the board. So all in all, I would say white has a slight advantage. Both sides have pretty active positions. I do think white is a little bit more aggressive. Nakamura is kind of in a spot where his light square bishop is still just kind of holding on defensively to protection. This knight is nicely placed. White does have control of this open file right here. And this knight right here on f6 is not doing a whole heck of a lot. Now pawn to b4, just kind of stopping the push from Nakamura on the queen side. Knight here to d7, just trying to get into a better position here. Wasn't doing too much here on f6. Pawn here to a3, just solidifying both sides kind of had their pawns over here, so that's fairly normal. Knight here to f8, just kind of dancing around. Not any other great squares for Nakamura to go to, which kind of is probably frustrating for him. He likes to be pretty aggressive, have lots of open lines that he can play, but not many variations that he can get into. So he's just kind of forced to be moving his knight a little bit. So knight to f8, bishop back here to a1, a knight here to e6, queen here to a2, threatening this square here on d5. It all kind of comes back to this one very, very important square here on d5. Bishop back here to c7, knight here to d4, bishop here to b6, attacking the knight here, and then h4. So starting to put a little pressure on the king side, and the next move is pretty startling. I'm not going to lie. I think everyone that kind of watched this game was shocked to see it. I'm not sure if Nakamura just decided that he was tired of just kind of a lame-o position and wanted just some fireworks. But that's what he did. We got fireworks. He plays knight takes here on g3, sacrificing a knight for a pawn, looking for compensation, clearly, after the pawn takes. Play knight takes here on d4. After the bishop takes here on d4. Pawn takes. Now queen to e3. Check. Queen to f2. Queen takes here on d3. And I really think, afterwards he said that Sergei, he kind of thought one move deeper. And I think there was the next move that Nakamura didn't see. He didn't say what he was expecting. My guess is he thought maybe queen here to f2. Potentially was expecting queen here to king here to h2. Both of those I think are extremely good for black. He has a very, very active position on board. He could have come away with this, up a pawn. Things are looking really good for him. Unfortunately, Nakamura did not think quite as far ahead as Sergei Karjakin did, and he missed this move right here. Rook to c7 is a complete dagger. There's no way to overcome this. He's threatening both the queen here on f7, which is check and not a lot of moves. He's also threatening just taking the bishop right here, which would put Nakamura down an entire piece. Pawn to f5, you gotta stop the checkmate, but you can't stop the bishop falling here on b7. Pawn here to h6, sure, but now the bishop's going to gobble up more material right here. Bishop takes here on d5. King here to h7, bishop down here to g2. We see the rook down here to e2, kind of a last-ditch effort, and then bishop here to f1, saying, hey, if you're going to move your rook, I'm going to take your queen. And in this position, Nakamura had to resign. Sergei Karjakin takes round 2 with a strong performance, really, really well prepared, put a lot of pressure on his opponent, knew what his opponent liked to do, and put him in a tough spot where Nakamura really couldn't get anything going. The entire match was just kind of playing the Queen's Indian defense very defensively, and at the very end tried to make something happen, but unfortunately he just didn't calculate all the way through, and unfortunately fell in round 2. So he's got 12 matches to make up for it. Hopefully he has a better showing the rest of the way, but tough start for him. So he'll be coming back tomorrow, definitely looking for a win. But exciting round 2. We've had some great matches so far. Hopefully you guys are enjoying this tournament. One of the longer tournaments that we have, but we have the best players in the world playing. So excited to see this. But everyone, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.